But I have maybe 3 or 4 key messages that I do want to get across today. And the first one is that as the world is changing, how we talk about that change matters. So the metaphors we use, the stories we tell, what worries us when we see a headline in the newspaper or we read in the advice from an investment bank, the selection of that data, that knowledge is increasingly important. Because the second point is it focuses our mind on what we pay attention to in different ways. And so my first key point is when we think about as complicated and challenging a topic as the transformations of the entire economy through technology, the key challenge strategically for CEOs today is to be able to zoom out well beyond your own organization and 5-year plan to a very wide frame. And I will give you an incredibly wide frame to start with this morning. But then to be able to zoom in using that perspective to go to what really matters for your customers, your clients, your employees, and your investors. And that journey is becoming more difficult because there are many more controversies and disagreements about what matters outside. And you as business leaders have many more competing things to focus on within organizations. So what I'm going to do today is zoom out and set a glide path, like the landing of an aeroplane. I can't possibly know anywhere near as much as you do about your own organizations and what matters for you. So all I can do is really set a kind of a metaphor and a landing path that I hope then will take your conversations to the next level with Carlos, with Crescendo, with you as a community as well. The second key message then is really around a key strategic mindset change is a valuable asset today. So being able to do this zoom in and zoom out is increasingly important. But translating that into collaboration, forms of interpersonal relationships for your staff and for you is also then becoming much more important. Because as we see that we zoom out, that things are changing, we realize how much we don't know in our own organizations and how much more we need to work with others. And the forum, at the heart of the World Economic Forum, is the multi-stakeholder principle. And the multi-stakeholder principle works on 2 levels. The first level is it says these massive global challenges that we care about cannot be solved just by business, by government, by civil society. We need new and different forms of cooperation and collaboration. But the second level is to say, you as a CEO don't just have a duty to shareholders in creating sustainable value over time. That is the core duty. It's written into corporate governance. But in order to achieve that, there are new ways of collaborating and working outside the boundaries of the firm. And then where I'm going to land at the end of this is probably a familiar topic for all of you, but it's around how talent and the people that work for you and work with you, your peers at the C-suite, and the skills that they have are really the key determinants of how you can manage the changes that are going on. So that's the kind of key messages that I'll mention, and I'll be throwing a few graphs and images up to try and maybe trigger some thinking there. But please feel free to just wave me on forward if this is stuff you've already heard before. So this is the first thing because art and metaphor and storytelling is actually how we really understand the world. And this is, apologies for putting a German painter in front of you. This is Caspar Friedrichs, and this is a German romantic painter painting of the wanderer above the sea of fog. And for me, this has been reimagined by a Korean artist, as you can see. But for me, this is what it feels like to be on an executive committee, a CEO, on a board, at a policymaker today looking at the technology landscape. For most of the vista in front of us is obscured by cloud. We feel that we're lucky to be up high, but at the same time, it feels like that's a barrier to getting things done and moving forward. And we're desperately trying to get a mobile phone signal to find our way forward. Or perhaps we're viewing the entire landscape through the screen of a device in our hands. But there are also some other important parts of this metaphor that I think we should recognize. The first one is this is clearly a very privileged gentleman who has the opportunity to see in there. And we here today have the privilege of sitting in a room and flying in from Geneva, like Silvio and I have, and talking about these things. But the changes ahead affect many more people than just those of us working in the leading companies in Spain. So how do we think about those who are less privileged to be wearing a formal attire while hiking in the Alps? And the second thing is that this is clearly a gentleman. And we know that less than 5% of CEOs in the Fortune 500 are women. It's about 3.8% here in Europe. So understanding how we attain and understand the relationship with gender equality and other engagement of these things is actually incredibly important. So understanding what the dominant metaphor is and trying to shift our thinking to bring other perspectives in is really important. And I put this slide up only to show that this is the story that the Forum is telling around the world right now about the fourth industrial revolution. We live in a time of unprecedented change. Now, many people might say, we've been through many different periods of change before. The world always feels disruptive. What's different about today? And it's interesting looking back that we seem to be at an inflection point where the rate of change is high enough that we notice it all around us every day. And certainly everyone's telling us that it's changing, including the World Economic Forum, so we notice it. But secondly, it's starting to feel a little bit out of kilter. And I'll use the words of Madeleine Albright to kind of give this perspective, which is to say, we face 21st century challenges. We're looking at them with a very much a 20th century mindset. Our organizations are built around 20th century formats. And the governance institutions that we rely on to provide a lot of the basis for this, including education, are really 19th century institutions. So this sense of not just unprecedented change, but the gap between how organizations and institutions and mindsets are able to deal with that change feels like it's becoming more of a tension every day. We live in interconnected systems, but we can't work on these things alone. So how do we create better collaborative platforms? And Creciendo is one of those platforms to having a look at these issues. You will have seen many of these big technology trends before, but the reason this change is happening faster is partly because there are core drivers in technology that are happening, that are delivering change faster than linear systems, than the way we normally think of as the advance of an organization or a way of working. The classic example is Moore's law applied to data storage. So this is the drop in cost of a gigabyte, and actually it's well below that now and continuing to fall. This is even more dramatic. It cost around $3 billion in 2003 to do a whole genome sequencing of the first human genome. Now you can get it done for less than $500. That's 6 orders of magnitude of cost reduction in about 17 years. That's incredible, and that blows apart many of the areas of research and understanding in this space. Something still that's not quite there yet, but is absolutely world-shaking when it happens, and I say when it happens, is the inflection point of energy storage, energy density, and the power-to-weight ratio of our ability to store electricity. This is a physics problem. It comes in new materials. It's also an efficiency problem that comes with artificial intelligence. But there is a huge disruptive effect here in drones, in remote development contexts for electricity, obviously in transport and automation, when we start to realize that we no longer need to charge our phones overnight, but in fact can deliver very clean energy to almost anywhere in the world at a quite light form factor, so it can also fly. It's really, we don't pay much attention to this, but we're talking one more order of magnitude change in energy density, which has not happened for the last 20 years, but we can just come over that area. It will change almost every industry at the application consumer use end. And where is this coming from? This is coming because technologies are combining. thanks to the internet, thanks to more collaborative research methods, thanks to the fact that genome editing like CRISPR, genome editing technology that allows you to very precisely and efficiently edit the genomes of plants, of animals, and indeed of human beings, that is not just a breakthrough that allows us to do better editing of rare diseases. It's also a technique that then opens up whole new areas of drugs and other factors, other ways of approaching similar problems. And at the moment, I've just come from Geneva, where with the United Nations, we were talking about artificial intelligence for good. The rising impact of artificial intelligence systems in everything from space imagery and uses, all the way through, of course, the things we do every day, text prediction, etc. But even in very complex challenges like urban design, these applications are combining with sensors, with biological technologies, with whole systems and energy approaches as well to create massive change. So this kind of exponential effect is partly a fact of digital systems, but partly just a fact that we live in a much more interconnected science and knowledge society. And Mark Zuckerberg's foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, is looking now to open up access to every single scientific publication, journal publication worldwide. They're looking just to buy the rights from all the Springers and the different academic publishers and say, guys, let's all just have, wherever you are in the world, let's be able to access this knowledge, but more importantly, run consistently artificial intelligence algorithms across this to find more and better combinations of insights in different disciplines and fields and help and make that produce new knowledge and new approaches. Now, this has never, ever happened before. It's still the case if you are a scientist in one field, you spend 99% of your time in that one silo because that's where the incentives are. Opening that up and broadening that is another opportunity for step change. And it impacts companies because with an opportunity for research and development to be based on artificial intelligence across worldwide networks, you can imagine how that will change innovation policy and approaches inside your organizations. An example of this is 3D printing these days. It hasn't, it's been talked about a lot, but it hasn't led to the changes that we see in our daily lives at home. Not all of us have a 3D printer yet, but in industry, it truly has been transformative. And now carbon 3D and similar SLP technologies, these are extractive technologies of 3D printing. The reason why this is important is it's more than 10 times faster than other forms of additive manufacturing that everyone has been talking about the last 2 to 3 years. So again, this element of change is a combination of, in this case, artificial intelligence platforms, new materials, and an entirely new way of thinking about the production of physical goods. And in fact, I think it was Cisco recently that in 2 days produced router boxes, customized router boxes using the carbon 3D approach that would have taken them 5-6 weeks using traditional 3D printing methods, which just goes to show that if you're within a company thinking about some of the more physical barriers that you need to overcome, new techniques like this could completely replace the ways that you're working already. But now I want to zoom well back, because I've talked about some of these trends, but how do they fit into this bigger story of what it means for us to enjoy our lives? And this curve here, you can see it starts in around 1750, goes to 2015, which is when we have the latest data. This is human development for OECD countries. This is human development. So human development is life expectancy, years of education, expected and actual education, and national income per capita. And you can see that there's been, for the OECD, about a 30-fold increase in our quality of life. So 3,000% increase of the quality of life, a little bit more, since around 1800 to today. Life expectancy here in Spain has been the most dramatic shift in the world. Spain is one of the very few countries that has more than doubled its life expectancy since 1900. And as you will have talked about in other forums, and I think we're talking about with Sergio recently, that creates challenges, and also as well as being a great thing for an economy as dependency ratios rise. But the goal is for this to happen, right? These are rich countries, right? We want other countries to experience this same rise, and I'll just mention that the greatest social injustice of industrial revolutions is that people do not get to experience them. We're very lucky here in Spain, in Australia, in Europe, in the US, to have experienced and ridden this curve up already. And we very much hope that our children will be able to continue to ride that curve of increasing meaningful work, increasing quality of life, increasing life expectancy. But there are 1.2 billion people in the world who don't have access to electricity in any form, 2.4 billion people in the world who don't have access to water and sanitation services. And clean water and sanitation, electricity, that was the second industrial revolution. Right? These were the massive changes that happened at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. And there are still 600 million people in the world who don't even have access to the basic technologies of the first industrial revolution, such as mechanization in agriculture or textile manufacturing, basic chemistry approaches that allow them to improve their lives. And if you break down this picture and you say, well, where have these industrial revolutions mattered? We talk about the fourth industrial revolution, but what do you actually mean? This is what I mean in a hopeful push. In about 1750, we started to see a rise of automation and approaches that lifted wages overall in the economy, although it cost laborers wages who were skilled artisans and manufacturers at the time. And that first industrial revolution delivered essentially fossil fuels and mechanization to large swathes of the US, Europe, and the North America. It took off incredibly quickly in Latin America as well in that period of time. And as you can see, then around the turn of the century in year 1900, the 20th century, another massive wave of innovation and combinations of innovation started to replace those systems. Electricity, the automobile, the jet engine, and aircraft were invented during this period of time. And probably least appreciated, but most importantly, the invention of artificial fertilizer. The Haber-Bosch synthesis process, which allows us to create ammonia, is responsible for us having 7.6 billion people on the planet today. Without that, we would still be struggling to feed probably 2 to 3 billion people today. So just that one invention that happened allows this explosion in life expectancy and income that we can see. And still today, that red proportion, and this is illustrative, but it also is validated against the proportion of technology in industries across OECD countries, that's responsible probably for most of the value we see around us today. And starting in the 1950s, but really exploding in the 70s and 80s, the digital revolution, the third industrial revolution, took a long time for this to appear in economic statistics, but we can see it now emerging quite clearly. The fourth industrial revolution sits on top of that. It treats the digital revolution in the same way that digital systems treated electricity. Absolutely essential. Critical infrastructure to run your 3D printing, to do your analysis of genome sequencing, to be able to have systems in space that deliver us incredibly high-resolution imagery, to do all kinds of analysis, to run artificial intelligence algorithms. None of that can happen without digital and the third industrial revolution. But it's one step beyond. These are systems that are steps beyond. And we hope that this results in raising everyone's living standards. Unfortunately, this is also a distinct possibility. It is also the fact that the world could see a reduction in life expectancy, an increase in challenges, not necessarily just because of the fourth industrial revolution, but because our institutions, our policies, the way we work together are not working as well as they should. Unless you think, well, no, that's a very doomsday prediction. 2016 was the first year in which an advanced economy in the last 50 years has experienced a reduction in life expectancy, and that was the United States. So United States, people are now living fewer years. life expectancy at birth is falling in the United States. And there are many reasons for that being the case, but that shows a flattening of this curve, at least in terms of human development. So if it's up to us, if the future is not necessarily that uncovered vista out there, but is something that you create in your organizations every day, you make investment decisions, you hire people and let people go, you have conversations with peers, with politicians, you engage in foundation activity, you sit at the breakfast table with your family and you talk to them about plans and you think about your future. If the future is not written, what do we have to take care of in this wide view to make sure that we keep going up there? So this is still in this very zoomed out, but I'm going to start to come in now. The first thing is we do have to care intensely about how the benefits are distributed. And I don't mean this just purely in terms of social policy, but I do mean in terms of thinking about making sure we don't repeat the mistakes of previous industrial revolutions and concentrate the benefits purely in one section of the economy. And as Carlos said earlier, one of the biggest concerns here is the impact of new technologies on wage distribution and the health of the middle class. And in particular, the way that systems that build on technologies such as, well, systems and approaches like the gig economy may be pushing us towards an even more separated labor market, where there's a lot of people who are working for an algorithm and a few people who are lucky enough to run the companies that write those algorithms or control those systems. And that's not just a fear. Market concentration in the technology space is going up. It's a great thing for the large companies at the head of this, but it's a challenge in terms of ensuring distributions of benefits. We also have to make sure externalities are managed well. And probably for the first time in human history, we have to think about the fact that these technologies give us so much power that they're actually starting to change what it means for us to be human beings. And again, this sounds inflammatory, but for those of you who have a smartphone on you or within a couple of meters of you right now, we know that that actually feels like a part of you. If someone touches your phone or picks it up on the table, it feels like someone stroking your arm psychologically. It has the same impact in the brain. It actually feels like an appendage. And more technology is crossing the barrier of our brains and our skin, and we are augmenting ourselves in new ways. Again, has challenges for distribution. So gliding back in, what does this mean? We have to start to care particularly about the labor market. Here in Spain, we care intensely about the labor market, okay? And we have for some time now. Labor participation rates, where are they? Where is unemployment? Gosh, unemployment went up last quarter. That's a challenge. We weren't expecting it. In terms of the historical job losses for technology, they have always occurred. We know that's the case. For all capital, technologies have created job losses. They've also, of course, created new ones. What's different about the recent shift in automation and digital technologies is which sectors they're affecting and how they're affecting. But what this leads us to talk about, so if you think about the stories we tell, it leads us to say things like this. 47% of US jobs are at risk. 55.3% of Spanish jobs could disappear in the next decade. 51% of the hours worked by Chinese people, so across the whole economy, we're talking 350 million kind of worker days a year, right? This is the equivalent of 350 million workers in the economy, could be automated just with current technologies. So forget about the fast 3D printing. We're talking about just existing capital machinery produced in Spain or Switzerland or in Korea or in Japan and China that could be adopted by companies. These are huge numbers, and these are very scary. They lead to headlines like, robots are taking all the jobs from travel to translator, with due apologies to the simultaneous translation. It also leads to people to reject this view. Don't be stupid. That's not going to happen. Sure, we will lose some jobs, but robots and AI won't replace most jobs, says Tech Republic. Or, my favorite, the Wall Street Journal, robots aren't destroying enough jobs. And I guess when I think about that frame and the stories we tell, it's really important for us to not get into telling each other these stories as scare tactics about the impact of technology. And I don't say that because technology is all good, because it's not. It comes with those challenges I just mentioned. But if we just focus on these headline numbers, we make the mistake of thinking that every job can just be automated. And it's actually far, far from the truth. Very interesting work by McKinsey earlier this year, came out in January, showed that actually only 5% of job occupation categories are fully automatable. The challenge is that 60% of occupations have about a third of their activities that can be completely automated. So that's to say that within your organization, the challenge is not to think, gosh, which people can I fully replace? Which there will be some, but the challenge is not to identify them and get rid of them and replace them with capital machinery. The challenge is much more, the broader impact of this challenge is to look at how your workforce, how your staff create value in addition, and in addition to in terms of freeing up the time that can be automated by repetitive tasks today. So an example, in the Australian economy, over the last 15 years alone, the average Australian worker has gained more than 2 hours a week just of spending time in interpersonal relations, in creative activities, in information synthesis. So 2 hours, that's about 5% over the last 15 years in terms of their weekly activities and work tasks. Now, when you break that down to where value is created for Australian workers, it's overwhelmingly in those categories: interpersonal, information synthesis, and creative activities. This is true for someone who picks up the garbage on the street as much as it is for someone who's an investment banker. It's a spectrum because there are different percentages of those activities, but that shift is happening as a whole. So if we change our mindset from 47% of jobs at risk, and we start focusing on what people do every day, what are they physically engaging in as the three musicians play, less on the fact that that's a Pierrot, that's a Harlequin, or that's a monk, that's a job category, more on what they're actually doing. That's the strategic shift in terms of understanding how automation is affecting your organizations. Because 35% of core skills overall are changing across every industry as we speak today. Not at some point in the future, but right now. And for me, this is World Economic Forum research talking to HR managers. The most interesting part of this slide is the fact that media, entertainment, and information is the lowest disrupted skill industry in terms of skills. And that's because when we talk to media and entertainment companies, they say it's already happened. We have already been massively disrupted in the skills that our organizations need to do. So if you think about what's happened to a journalist, to speech writers, to other people who are engaged in entertainment, to TV companies, production companies, and you apply that to the industries at the top of the list, you can start to see how important it is to get a handle on this skills change. And those skills are overwhelmingly non-technical skills. These are interpersonal skills that are delivering more and greater value. So this is where I think we can really start to get a handle on what needs to happen strategically today and tomorrow in our organizations. Emotional intelligence, cognitive flexibility, these are not things that people teach at university or at school. They're also very hard for you to interview people on with a set list of questions. So thinking about these shifts is incredibly important for taking big changes in that zoom-out view of the fourth industrial revolution and applying them to how is your organization better prepared to create value. And I'll say one more thing, which is very interesting. For those of you who work in organizations where there is a long tail of workers who are paid at the minimum wage or close to the minimum wage, which is a lot of organizations around the world, obviously, the number one factor influencing job satisfaction, job engagement, and enjoyment is not how much they get paid or even how nice their work conditions are. It's the quality of their boss, the quality of the management above them. So if Spanish jobs and Spanish tasks are shifting more to creative, interpersonal, information synthesis roles and activities. If more value is being created there, you don't just have to hire people who have good skills in that level. You have to manage them in ways that allow that to happen. And so changing the way we think about how we manage from the CEO level all the way down is actually an incredibly important but often challenging task to take on through the company. I'll just mention here that, by the way, here in Spain and in the US, we have a very low competitive advantage on the technical side of skills. So most of the university graduates, and particular most of the STEM graduates, are not coming from this region whatsoever. So this is in terms of when someone tells you the future is all about STEM education, there's a bit of a challenge here policy-wise to think about where the competition comes from. And in terms of thinking about managing talent in the fourth industrial revolution, as I come back down this glide path and start to come to a close, there are three big things that I think that you can sum this up as. The first thing is obviously attracting, retaining, and developing staff. The second thing is your own leadership and your own strategic perspective as CEOs, as senior executives, and how you can not just generate that within your organization, but within the relationships that you have with key stakeholders, including your board. And understanding that as those tasks change, we also will need to adapt to different ways of working. And this is as true for you as a CEO as it is for someone who has to move from using a hardware solution to a software solution in the way they create value. And I'm just reminded of Mark Benioff from Salesforce, who we work with quite closely, and he has recently started to shake up all his executive committee meetings by having an artificial intelligence unit assess the quality of every presentation. The monthly meetings that he has with his senior executives, they present to him their numbers. He has an AI, which is, they call it Einstein. He has Einstein analyze that presentation and give a confidence quality ranking of that presentation back to that person. So you can imagine this is a very different way of working as a senior executive in terms of both preparing to present your results, your monthly results to the CEO, but it's also very different as the CEO to think about what sources you're relying on and how do you sensitively balance what the computer says versus what Frank or Mary says to you at that moment. As I come to a close, I think I want to go back to that picture of Friedrich's and say that if I had to sum up all of this, it would really be about retraining our brains to think from a systems level. So the zoom out, zoom in connection and practicing that as much as possible. The reason I show this image is that this was one of the most transformative technologies of the first industrial revolution. And you can see these in a museum today. They still operate. They're driven by steam. But as disruptive as this was, the impact that this machine had was not just on the way that it created cloth and wove it together. The systems view of this same machine is this. The systems view is around child labor and the way in which very cheap, low-cost labor replaced previously skilled artisans, and the reaction in labor policy that came in to protect people as a result of this. And so the challenge for all of us is to look at an array of quantum computing chips that are being installed and tested today and to think, what's the equivalent of this for quantum computing? Not just in terms of the downsides, but in terms of the whole system change that we do. And this is not easy. We've created a center in San Francisco just to focus on these questions, to look at the governance principles for emerging technologies. And we have 8 projects underway in the Presidio in San Francisco in collaboration with many of the technology partners in the Bay Area on the civilian use of drones, on ethics and artificial intelligence, on biotechnologies and gene editing, et cetera, et cetera. And if you'd like more information, Silvio and I can provide that. But the 4 principles that this is based on is, as a CEO, think about the systems, not the technologies. You will never be able to understand as much as you need to or want to know, no matter how geeky you might be, on the technologies. but having a systems perspective is where you will create value for your organization. Think about how you empower your staff rather than thinking about how you replace and determine them. Understand that we do create the future. This is not all coming at us. It is a result of the investment decisions that you make. And values are a feature of this, not a bug. So the values and the way you think about how you treat people matters. And this is all about leadership. So I just would leave you, as we move to the panel now, with the perspective that some of this is about technology leadership. But by no means can all of us be the data scientists or innovation leaders in this space. A lot of it is actually now about governance leadership, how we bring these things together and make it benefit us and others in a reasonable way. More and more, the ethical concerns of technology means this is about taking a stance on how these are implemented and who gets affected. And this is what we at the Forum combine in our centre, in our systems initiative work throughout everything we do across all our stakeholder groups, and we think of as the systems leadership needed for the fourth industrial